In the summer of 2000, the world believed peace might finally be within reach. US President Bill Clinton brought Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak and Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat to Camp David for what was billed as the most serious attempt yet to end decades of conflict. After years of war, intifadas, and broken promises, this summit was supposed to deliver the impossible: two peoples living side by side in peace. But instead of a historic treaty, Camp David ended in silence, mistrust, and recriminations. Within weeks, Jerusalem would erupt in protests, violence would spread across the occupied territories, and the Second Intifada would begin, a 5-year uprising that would become one of the bloodiest and most consequential chapters in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So how did hopes for peace collapse so quickly? Why did a summit meant to end violence instead unleash it on a scale no one could control? To understand that, we need to go back to the 1990s and the Oslo Accords. For the first time, Palestinians were promised autonomy through the Palestinian Authority, and Israelis were promised security through recognition. On paper, it was groundbreaking, but by the end of the decade, the reality looked much darker. Settlements across the West Bank and East Jerusalem expanded rapidly, cutting deep into the land Palestinians expected for their future state. Checkpoints, curfews, and military control over Palestinian daily life never disappeared. For many Palestinians, Oslo had not delivered freedom, but instead tightened the grip of occupation. For many Israelis, continued suicide bombings and attacks from militant groups during the 1990s made them feel peace was not working either. Hope collapsed into bitterness on both sides. That was the atmosphere when Clinton invited Barak and Arafat to Camp David in July 2000. Behind closed doors, the three men tried to resolve the issues that had haunted every negotiation. Who would control Jerusalem? How the borders of a Palestinian state would be drawn? And what would happen to millions of Palestinian refugees displaced since 1948? Barak's proposal gave Palestinians a state in most of Gaza and large parts of the West Bank. But Israel would keep major settlement blocks, control the Jordan Valley for years, and maintain sovereignty over key areas of East Jerusalem. Arafat rejected the offer, seeing it as fragmented, a patchwork of disconnected territories without true sovereignty. To him, it was not a state, but a trap. Barak, in turn, felt he had gone further than any Israeli leader before him and accused Arafat of rejecting peace itself. After 2 weeks of tense negotiations, the talks collapsed. No handshake, no joint statement, no agreement. Clinton blamed Arafat for walking away. Arafat blamed Israel for offering a prison disguised as a state. The air was thick with accusation, disappointment, and mistrust. And as both leaders returned home, the failure at Camp David became a spark. Within months, a single event would ignite a firestorm that neither side could contain. The collapse of Camp David left Palestinians furious and disillusioned. Many believed negotiations had been a sham, offering little more than a fragmented state under Israeli control. For Israelis, the failure deepened fears that no agreement would ever bring them peace. This tense and bitter atmosphere was the dry kindling. All it needed was a spark. That spark came on September 28, 2000, when Israeli opposition leader Ariel Sharon made a highly publicized visit to the Temple Mount, or Haram al-Sharif, in Jerusalem. This site is sacred to both Jews and Muslims. For Jews, the Temple Mount is the holiest place in their history. For Muslims, it is the location of the Al-Aqsa Mosque, the third holiest site in Islam. Sharon's visit, surrounded by hundreds of Israeli police officers, was seen by Palestinians as a deliberate provocation, a show of force on land they believed was being taken from them piece by piece. The reaction was immediate. Protests erupted around the Al-Aqsa compound and quickly spread to the West Bank and Gaza. Within days, demonstrations turned violent. Israeli security forces used live ammunition against stone-throwing protesters. Dozens of Palestinians were killed in the first week alone. Television screens across the Arab world showed images of heavily armed soldiers confronting young Palestinians with nothing but rocks in their hands. One of the most powerful and heartbreaking images came on September 30th, when 12-year-old Mohammed al-Daraa was shot and killed while cowering behind his father in Gaza, a moment captured on video and broadcast globally. For Palestinians, it became a symbol of their struggle. For Israelis, the violence looked like proof that Palestinians had never abandoned their war against Israel. The protests escalated into armed clashes. Militants began firing on Israeli soldiers, and Israel responded with tanks, airstrikes, and targeted assassinations. Suicide bombings inside Israeli cities returned, ripping through buses, cafes, and nightclubs, killing civilians and shattering any sense of security. Israeli military operations intensified across the West Bank and Gaza, with raids, curfews, and mass arrests. Both sides fell into a cycle of attack and retaliation. The violence escalated. The Second Intifada became far deadlier than the first uprising of the 1980s. Armed Palestinian groups, including Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and even elements of Fatah's own militias, began launching coordinated attacks. Suicide bombings shook Israel's major cities, Jerusalem, Tel Aviv, and Haifa, turning buses, markets, and restaurants into scenes of carnage. For ordinary Israelis, these attacks were a nightmare come true, reinforcing the belief that Palestinians had rejected peace and chosen terror. Israel responded with overwhelming force. Tanks rolled into West Bank towns. Fighter jets and helicopters struck targets in Gaza. Checkpoints multiplied, cutting off Palestinian communities from one another and strangling their economy. In April 2002, after a series of devastating suicide bombings, Israel launched Operation Defensive Shield, its largest military campaign in the West Bank since 1967. Cities like Jenin, Nablus, and Bethlehem were placed under siege. Entire neighborhoods were leveled, and hundreds of Palestinians were killed. Israeli forces surrounded Yasser Arafat's compound in Ramallah, effectively imprisoning him for the last years of his life. The violence left both societies traumatized. Palestinians saw their cities destroyed and their leaders besieged, while Israelis lived in constant fear of the next bombing. Trust between the two peoples, already fragile, collapsed completely. International observers tried to step in with peace initiatives, most notably the 2003 Roadmap for Peace, brokered by the United States, the European Union, the UN, and Russia. But each side blamed the other for the bloodshed, and the killings continued. Amid the chaos, Ariel Sharon, the same man whose visit to the Temple Mount had ignited the uprising, was elected Prime Minister of Israel in early 2001. He promised security and a hardline stance, and for many Israelis, he delivered. Sharon ordered the construction of the West Bank Barrier, a vast concrete and barbed wire wall that cut through Palestinian land. To his supporters, it was a shield against terror. To Palestinians, it was another tool of occupation, carving away their future state. The Second Intifada formally wound down around 2005, but its consequences remain inescapable. It reshaped the geography, politics, and psychology of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. For Palestinians, the uprising was a symbol of defiance, but also a devastating blow. Their leadership was weakened, their society divided, and their economy shattered. The dream of a sovereign Palestinian state seemed more distant than ever. For Israelis, the Intifada hardened attitudes. The suicide bombings in particular created a lasting sense of fear and mistrust. Many concluded that negotiations were pointless, that concessions would only invite violence. This shift in public opinion paved the way for leaders like Ariel Sharon and later Benjamin Netanyahu to pursue policies of unilateral control, expansion of settlements, and a reliance on military force rather than compromise. Internationally, the uprising shifted narratives too. Sympathy for Palestinians grew in some parts of the world, where images of children facing tanks and refugee camps under siege dominated headlines. But at the same time, the use of suicide bombings eroded support among others, painting the Palestinian struggle as synonymous with terrorism in the post-9/11 era. The Second Intifada became part of a broader global conversation about security, extremism, and the price of failed diplomacy. Looking back, many historians argue the seeds of the Intifada were sown long before Camp David collapsed. Decades of occupation, failed promises, expanding settlements, and political distrust made violence almost inevitable. The peace talks may have been the spark, but the fire was already smoldering. Today, walls and checkpoints remain. Gaza is under blockade, the West Bank is fragmented, and both peoples carry the trauma of those years. The Second Intifada was not just a chapter of history, it was a turning point, the moment when hope for peace gave way to cynicism and when mistrust became the norm. And this is why understanding the Second Intifada is so critical. It wasn't only about failed negotiations, it was about what happens when dialogue collapses, when leaders fall back on fear, and when ordinary people are caught in the middle of forces far beyond their control. If you found this video informative, remember to like,